The following episode of the Movie Club podcast can and will contain spoilers. Please be aware of this before you listen. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Movie Club podcast, the monthly or bi-monthly podcast where we pick two movies, sit down, watch them, and then come together to talk about them and analyze them and just have a lot of fun doing it. So thanks for joining us. Once again, we have a pretty cool round table of hosts here, and we'll introduce ourselves right now, starting with me. I'm Sean from filmjunk.com.
I'm Jay from the documentary blog and Film Junk.
I'm Kurt from row3.com and twitchfilm.net.
My turn. Omar from Twitch.
And I am Andrew from row 3. And I already have to go pee.
Nice. So this episode we are talking about two, I'm not really quite sure how they're related, but one's a documentary and one is not. We're going to start with Errol Morris's The Thin Blue Line, and then we're going to move into Werner Herzog's Stroszek, which should be pretty interesting, I think. Jay, I think you kind of were the instigator for both of these movies, so maybe you can intro each of them, starting with The Thin Blue Line.
Great, Sean. Thanks. So The Thin Blue Line is directed by Errol Morris, who's one of my favorite filmmakers. And it's basically a noir crime mystery thriller in documentary form. And this is why it's kind of an important film, because it's one of the first, it's not the first, I would imagine, but one of the first documentaries to really mix cinematic, dramatic filmmaking with nonfiction filmmaking. And with, I think, pretty awesome results. And it's an important movie because it actually impacted the real life story of what's depicted in the film. So it's sort of a reenactment heavy documentary, and I think it was not nominated at the Oscars because of this. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the film because Errol Morris decided to retell the story of this murder mystery through a lot of reenactment using actors, intercut with talking head footage, and so there, it's kind of, put a wrench in the big documentary machine of all these people who are purists and think that documentaries should be told in a specific fashion. So it really opened up documentary filmmaking, I guess, as an art form.
Was there a lot of film, or not film, but television that used reenactments before this, or was the reenactments started on TV after this?
This was apparently a big influence on television reenactments.
The movie came out in 1988, and I mean, to me, right away I think of like Rescue 911, Unsolved Mysteries, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And I mean, those were around that time. I don't know which came first exactly, but I guess I could...
It's funny. It's something you totally take for granted now. So...
Rescue 911 started in 89, so basically the year right after. So.
They copied.
Pretty much.
Unless Errol Morris got some sort of leaked treatment for Rescue 911 and was like, I got to beat these guys to the punch. So yeah, I mean, one interesting thing that I like about Errol Morris in general is he's very specific about the look of his films. And this movie has two cinematographers, and it's interesting because one guy, Robert Chappelle, I believe he did all the Talking Heads interviews, he worked with Errol Morris on a number of films after this as well. But Stefan Zapsky did the reenactments, and he has worked with Tim Burton on a number of, like he did Edward Scissorhands, Batman Returns, Ed Wood. So it's interesting that a documentary filmmaker would actually be so concerned about his visuals that he would bring a dramatic filmmaker, cinematographer in to handle his film. I mean, he did this later on with Robert Richardson as well, splitting the duties with Robert Chappelle. So he's definitely a cinematic filmmaker, and it definitely shows in this film.
Yeah, I guess maybe we should each, as we usually do, kind of go around and give some initial impressions of the movie. This was my first time seeing the movie, and I mean, I liked it a lot. It's definitely, if you've seen other Errol Morris movies, it's very specific style, as Jay mentioned. But I think one thing that I noticed, like, I know he's kind of known for the Interrotron looking into the camera kind of thing, and that wasn't really used here, right? So did that come after this film?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was on Mr. Death. I don't know if he used that on A Brief History of Time or not, but I mean, there's Errol Morris now, and there's Errol Morris then, and Errol Morris now, I still like him, but I don't think he's gotten very obsessed with interviews and that Interrotron, and his films are getting more and more talking heads heavy. People love Fog of War. I like it too, but it's certainly not my favorite film of his. If you look back at Thin Blue Line and then Gates of Heaven and Vernon, Florida, he is a little more open in his filmmaking, I think. He doesn't... He tends to cut to old movie footage a lot. He does this in Thin Blue Line here and there, but he really does that quite often. Like in Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, he'll use a lot of old film clips and stuff. And I don't know. I prefer his earlier work, I guess, but Thin Blue Line is the perfect combination of the two, I think.
Yeah, this was my first time with the movie. I always remembered it as one of these, like, really early Miramax movies that had a lot of infamy around it, partly because it affected the case that he's documenting, but partly just the way the movie fit into the Miramax catalog, which was mostly doing foreign and distributed stuff. But to sit down and watch it, having watched a number of other Errol Morris movies, it was really interesting to see that, yeah, it's almost like he is going backwards. Like, this is like a perfect movie. I won't forget the shake in this movie, that spinning, spiraling shake. There's a lot of really powerful images. And I don't know, I guess the interview stuff that you mentioned is totally there, in that the people that talk to him just practically confess to him. It's amazing that you have a camera and you're just chatting with someone, and you can get them to the point where they pretty much confess to something that they've gone through the whole legal and everything else, and to get this sort of intimacy with both parties in this movie was pretty amazing to watch.
Well, I think too that, like, I don't know how often, when you think journalism and stuff like that, and people, investigative journalism, you think, like TV shows, newspapers, things like that. You don't usually think filmmaker, I don't think. I mean, I'm sure there's been situations, way before this movie where it was done, but I mean, this is a great example of someone making a film, going in, finding out things that no one else had found out, and it makes the film pretty special because of it. I guess we'll throw it over to Omar. What were your initial impressions of the film?
Well, this was my first time watching the film, and I noticed after I looked Errol Morris up that I have only seen one of his films, one other film, and that was Mr. Death, which I really liked, actually. But I, for some reason, thought I had seen something else, but looking over his filmography, it doesn't seem like I've seen anything else by him. So, but I've heard about this one, but actually never gotten around to watch it. So, and I really liked it. It was quite interesting to see how a case which was so blatantly, complete bullshit all the way through got, resulted in the end that it got. I mean, for this guy to be sentenced for life for a crime he obviously didn't do, and it seemed to be apparent to everyone, even the prosecutor, but somehow they got it through that Randall Adams got himself in prison for life, and it wasn't until he got that interview on tape that things started to change for him. So, and I really like the way he handles the cinematics, and of course, because you've seen this type of format before, and seeing that this film kind of pioneered it. It doesn't seem, as to me at least, doesn't feel as what do you call it?
Raw.
Yeah, and just if I had seen it back in the day, it'd probably be more impressive. But it's like watching a genre film, a sequel to a classic genre film, and then you watch the original, and you kind of, you don't feel you're not as impressed with the original because you've seen it done over and over and over.
Well, it's like when I first saw Jaws 3D and then went back and watched the first Jaws and was like, this is no Jaws 3D.
Exactly. No, yeah, so, but it's really good. And has there been anything done as a follow-up to this film in terms of following the case after Harris confessed that he screwed Adams?
There is no film follow-up, but I mean, you can read about it. He eventually was executed for the crime that he was in jail in the film. But he confessed, but he was never, I don't think he ever officially confessed. Like, he was never charged for that. The only result was Adams being released. But after he was released, he actually sued Errol Morris, which is an interesting twist after the film for it, because he felt Errol Morris was trying to take advantage of his life story rights.
Yeah, that's something I would actually like to see, like a follow-up on that, because especially the prosecution side, because they obviously knew that Harris was lying. I mean, it was. I felt that it was so apparent in the film that everybody knew he was lying, but they were, for some reason, trying to pin it all on Adams. And I would like to understand why they were doing that.
So I think it's similar to the West Memphis 3 thing, where it's like these people get so caught up in solving the crime initially, and then when things start popping up that say, okay, maybe this is not so, it's more of a just not wanting to go back on their decision or their word. They just stick to what they said.
Well, I also thought it was a combination of regardless of these other facts, we stand a much better chance of getting this one through. So it didn't seem to be about like serving justice. It seemed to be it seemed to be more like an actuarial thing. There's this guy and his set of circumstances, and this guy and his set of circumstances, and it doesn't matter who's guilty or not. We stand a better chance because of the age and the this and the that and whatever with this other guy. So we're just going to go ahead and do the other guy. That's what I got when I was watching the movie.
Well, there was something that stood out to me, and maybe this was just a throwaway line or something, but at some point in one of the interviews, somebody said something about how they didn't want to convict, or they didn't want to screw up a 16-year-old's life or something, because the one who actually committed the crime was like a young kid, and the people in that community were almost, it sounded like they were protecting him because he was like one of their own, whereas the
This
other
guy was a drifter.
Yeah, the other guy wasn't. So it seemed like they just decided to protect him and pin it on the other guy because he wasn't from around there or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of sort of in the same boat as Omar in that, first of all, this is my first viewing as well, and surprisingly, the only other Errol Morris film that I've seen is Fog of War. I think this movie is more interesting. Discussing again in the last 5 minutes, it's more interesting what happened because of the film and the side stuff than actually watching the film itself. And maybe that's a symptom of watching it 12 years later. But I don't know. While I was watching it, I was relatively unimpressed. Like, I was kind of bored. I'd be captivated for maybe 10 minutes, and then there'd be a 10-minute stretch where I was just really bored and didn't care at all. I wasn't all that hooked into the story. I mean, I kind of compare it a lot to probably Paradise Lost. And for some reason with that film, I was totally involved in the case and interested in wanting to see what was going on. Whereas here, I don't know. The people that they were interviewing were so excruciatingly dull to listen to talk.
Not the two principals though. The Adams and the kid or Harris were. I found them to be very compelling. I found both of them to be very compelling.
Monotone and so. He barely opens his mouth. I mean, maybe you could call that an interesting character trait, but I just kind of got dull with it. And then later on in the film, they start adding in more bits of the case, that there were all these witnesses and stuff that, like, I don't know why that wasn't given to us right away in the beginning, that information. And they throw us these new characters, or, well, I guess I'd call them characters, people, witnesses, whatever, and they too were so just, they were just caricatures, like the one guy that was scared to tell anybody because that he was with a girl that night as he drove by because his wife would kill, like, and the blonde lady, they were so unanimated and uninteresting to listen to talk. I mean, you can.
Well, I think the structure was, and I'm speculating here just from a few things that I've read about the movie, because that's the great thing about documentaries. You watch a documentary and it captivates you, and then you just want to know more. And it must have been very frustrating to watch this in 1988, pre-internet, where you can't just get that instant, spend an hour browsing around. But I think the initial reaction was that this film was almost structured like a modern documentary, like Man on Wire, where it's almost like a genre or a noir style. And I think, I didn't get this when I was watching it, but I think the intent of holding back those witnesses and that was to make you think that Adams was guilty, and this was a straight up documentary that he was guilty, and then it's supposed to peel back the layers. But curiously, now I knew some things about the movie going in, and that may have affected things, but I never got that. Adams is such a easygoing, nice, laid back guy that I never really ever thought of him as the killer. But I see what you're saying with all these witnesses and that. I believe they held all that stuff back to just make it play like Adams was the killer, and then slowly flip the whole thing on its head and say, oh, wait a minute, Harris is the kid is the killer. It's almost like a reveal. Now, I didn't get that when I was watching it, but I felt that the film was edited in that fashion to accomplish that.
Well, it's clearly a part of it, because even within the witnesses, once they're introduced, you meet this woman who says she clearly saw who was in the car, and she's basically the one who testified against Harris or against Adams and put him away. And then eventually you learn that from her husband, that she was trying to pin some drug thing on him, and he basically says she'll try to put anyone away that she can. And that's something that is revealed throughout, like, over time with her. And then the guy who drives by, who says eventually that he was with his wife, it's a similar thing. It's like, okay, well, it's one thing to say that you drove by and you saw something, and then it's another thing to say, oh, by the way, I had a woman in my car that I didn't want anyone to know. It's
everyone has their own agenda that they're hiding. Like
it's
a noir.
interesting how they played with memory too, because he said, "Oh, I saw him very clearly. I turned around and I think the cop car was behind the other car, or wait, maybe the cop car was in front of the car, but I know it was pulled over, and the police officer was right up to the window, and he was, or wait, no, maybe actually he was. Well, now let me think about this for a second. Like, just an example of how the human mind or human memory is completely flawed by." He says one statement right away and then sort of contradicts himself in the next 15 sentences that he uses, that he doesn't necessarily remember all that. Like, there were all those little moments like that of fascination for me. And then they would go on to somebody else talking about something that wasn't quite as interesting to me.
You didn't like
also,
go ahead.
Did everybody in the room, in the virtual room here, know before watching the movie that it actually had an impact on the outcome of the entire story? No. I purposely go into movies, as I've said many times, knowing as little as possible, just to be for the surprise factor and go in fresh and everything. I kind of feel like I wish I had known a little bit more about this case before watching the movie. I kind of wish I had hopped on IMDb and read some stuff.
Well, I think, didn't it say something on the actual DVD case about that? I had heard it somewhere, but I certainly wasn't actively seeking out information before I watched it. But yeah, I mean, I guess, I think your point is interesting and leads into something else I wanted to bring up, which is, just Errol Morris's style. He's a very detail-oriented guy, which is, especially when you look at, there's been a lot of these kind of court case investigative documentaries over the last few years, and it's you look at The Thin Blue Line and you compare it to something like Dear Zachary, and it's the complete polar opposite, because Dear Zachary is charged with emotion and it's manipulative and all this kind of stuff, whereas Thin Blue Line to me feels very cold, and I guess clinical is the word that I would use to describe a lot of Errol Morris's stuff. And
there's a humor in there though that is very obvious, I think. The details. The movie is about details. It's standard operating procedure is, yes, it's about the Abu Ghraib prison thing, but it's about the power of a photograph. And I think this movie is just as much about memory and details, because we're going over those same reenactments over and over, and what people remember, what they don't remember. The one prosecutor that tells the story of his dad being at the theater when Dillinger was killed, and just that story about the orange dress versus the red dress is a perfect example of that. So it's when you're visiting these people's stories and they're talking about things that seem irrelevant, it's because that's what they're drawing from that night. He talks about watching the Carol Burnett show. That's an interesting thing. The emphasis on the Burger King milkshake, it's clearly supposed to have some sort of humorous element to it, seeing that milkshake fly over and over and discussing, did it, was she drinking it in the car? Did she get out? Did it hit the ground? What happened? To me, reads funny.
Yeah,
it just reads so much analysis that it's to the point of a quirkiness. And the time they spend in the drive-in theater, the movies they watch, talking specifically about what movies they watched. And the guy saying specifically, I didn't want to stay. I liked the first movie, but I didn't want to stay for the second one because it was a cheerleader movie. Wasn't really interested, but he wanted to watch the movie. And it's just all those little details seem unimportant, but they're all a part of it.
Well, yeah, they go to town with the clock and the popcorn, and you're right. Mm-hmm. It is, by the fifth time you come into that, it does start to get funny, because it's like almost like an SCTV parody where they'll just keep overemphasizing. But he's also, whether it is unintentionally or intentionally funny, that's the point, is that the filmmaker is also basically giving you the bullet points of why the case is flawed. Like, how could he be buying popcorn 3 hours after the concessions were closed? And these are major points that, I imagine Morris himself was keen on, because he becomes an investigator of sorts when he's assembling the movie and trying to turn all of these disparate interviews and stuff into a narrative, which, he clearly wants this to be far more a feature film than a documentary. And I believe Herzog, who we're going to talk about next, always called documentaries feature films on the sly. That's... And doing those details make the movie. I agree to an extent with Andrew that the talking head stuff, some of it is quite dry. A lot of the people are either uncomfortable in the camera, or they don't have enough screen time, or they're just like that gossip lady who I quite liked in the movie that just seemed to want to chat. But ultimately he has to pull this into some sort of narrative, and the way he does that, he becomes a detective, and it shows in the film.
Well, he worked as a private investigator previous to becoming a filmmaker, and clearly he has an obsession with that. What you don't see is when you see these interviews on screen, like especially the two leads, you don't see like the 2 years spent conversing with these guys and trying to get them to appear on camera. Daniel Harris skipped a meeting with Errol Morris for an interview and killed someone that night. That's why he's in prison. So it's interesting that, with the relationship of the filmmaker to the subject, just being on camera is a feat in general. Whether or not they're animated, they're in prison. They're I don't know. They're Southern guys. To me, it just, if people are a little too animated, it seems that it's just that the camera is on and they're performing. With the lack of animation in these people, to me, that just shows that they are insanely comfortable with what they're talking about and what they're doing. You could argue that maybe it could cut back on some of the talking head stuff, but I think this is just a film about analysis. Well, and the reenactments are meant to be exactly that. They're just, all they are is they're shot completely unrealistically, and the weird thing is the sound effects in the reenactments are really, like, the gunshot is really fake sounding, and you hear the whirring of the light on top of the car, and they're just meant as illustrations, and they're meant to be looked at over and over and over again. And his choice of images are so striking that when you rewatch these reenactments, it's like you can immediately tell, okay, that was different last time, that was different last time. And they never show the actual version of what did happen. Well, which is interesting.
I like how when they show the blue car pulling away 2 or 3 times, but with the different emblem on the back, when they discover that they've been looking for the wrong car the whole time. Mm-hmm. I sort of like that idea of, again, human memory and what they were thinking about, and how time can sort of alter your perception of how things actually were. But in terms of like the milkshake and showing the clock, all that stuff, those are, you're right, they're important details of the case. It matters where the milkshake dropped, because that matters where she was standing. And I thought, I don't know, I didn't see humor in it. I was it looked to me like it was just trying to be artful. And maybe to some people it is. To me, it was just like, okay,
it's no broken embraces, is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Well, it is. It's funny that
the milkshake just run down the highway for 2 minutes wasn't that long, but it was just like, come on. I'm more interested in the case than watching this.
Well, but no, I think that's the wrong way to look at it, because showing something once, you just process it and move it on. Showing something twice might underscore it, but showing something 4 and 5 times, then you start to build like a musical piece. That's what makes it, an art film or an artistic movie. So you're joking with the broken embraces, but that in a way that's exactly what filmmakers like Pedro Almodovar and David Lynch or whoever call back and emphasize things by showing things again and again and again. That's how you construct fictional films, and that's what I think distinguishes The Thin Blue Line compared to your average crime documentary. I mean, even the Paradise Lost guys don't have this level of art to what they're doing. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to make a documentary, but I don't know. I tend to prefer this way. I want something to edge more into a fictional feature film than a straight up documentary.
Well, I mean, there's a time and a place for certain things, and I think the main thing with this film is it's a retrospective case. Everything has happened. It's all in the past. Paradise Lost they're filming it as it's going, and so their approach is a little more raw, I guess, and I like those films as well. But yeah, I mean, in terms of The Thin Blue Line, I just like it as a look at, obsessive analysis of something, and the fact that it actually had an impact is a bonus, I guess. But I mean, you look at any of the essays that Errol Morris writes for the New York Post or the Times.
The Crimean War cannonball post is 50,000 plus words on 2 photographs of cannonballs in the road from a war in the 19th century.
Yeah.
And it is awesome. It's actually a compelling, fascinating read. And he goes everywhere, and it's essentially just a photo of cannonballs on the road and photograph of possibly cannonballs that have been artificially moved off the road. And the fact that he can go 50,000 words, multiple flights, 150 years plus on afterwards, that he took himself to look at the lay of the land and everything. It really shows an obsessive mind.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I guess to me, like, I agree that the movie plays as funny at times, and I mean, it reminded me a little bit. The interviews reminded me a bit of like Gates of Heaven, just the kind of quirky characters that he managed to capture. But I mean, this also reminded me of the now infamous letter that Harvey Weinstein supposedly sent to Errol Morris, where he was, I guess Errol Morris was on was it a radio show?
NPR, yeah.
NPR, and he was talking about The Thin Blue Line, and Harvey Weinstein thought he was just flat out boring. And he sent this letter saying basically, like, talk in short sentences, don't bore people, you're not pulling people into the movie. And I think he says, if you continue to be boring, I will hire an actor in New York to pretend that he's Errol Morris. If you have any casting suggestions, I'd appreciate that. So, I mean, like, to me, it's like, it's funny, but, and this kind of relates a little bit to Werner Herzog as well. It's like, with both of these guys, it's like, how much of it is intentionally funny and how much of it is just their own kind of quirky obsessions coming out as funny. That's like, I don't know the answer to that, but I mean, it's,
I think they're probably 98% intentionally funny, personally.
You think so?
Well, Morris, from everything that I've read about Morris, is that he's a super anxious guy, and that he's a worrier. I mean, if there's a connection between the two films on this podcast, it's the fact that those two guys were friends. And at one point, they were supposed to dig up Ed Gein's mother's grave because Morris was friends with Ed Gein, and he had sort of spotted all the graves that Gein had dig up. You know, he was the model for Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And anyways, he had plotted all the graves in the graveyard that he had dug up for this or that. And they all circled, apparently, Ed Gein's mother's grave. And these two guys knew each other, and they were supposed to, meaning Herzog and Morris, they were supposed to meet and dig up the grave to see whether or not Gein had dug up his mom. And of course Herzog was there because Herzog's Herzog, and he flew in from Germany and blah blah blah. But Morris, being a bit more of a worrier and whatnot, and even though he did all the research, like he knew Gein personally and spent loads of times like with these guys in The Thin Blue Line interviewing them, he he's like, well, what if we get caught? And, what am I going to tell my mom if the police haul me in for digging up the grave of a serial killer's mother? And you read a lot of things about Morris and like the legal battles he had with the subject of The Thin Blue Line. I mean, a lot of it is, well, yeah, I'm using this guy's life story, and I've spent hours and hours and hours filming the reenactments and putting everything together. I mean, I let this guy out, but at the same time, he's like, well, it's still this guy. And whereas Herzog, I think, would come at it from a different approach. So, but I agree when you say they're both super idiosyncratic, and I don't know if I completely agree with Jay of saying that it's 98% intentional. I think a lot of, particularly earlier in Morris's career, it was who he is. He's probably more
the humor in their films. I think the humor in their films is 98% intentional. I mean, there are things in his films that just times that things are cut on, like just comedic timing and things he leaves in that he didn't have to leave in at all, that play for humor. But that's just me. I don't know. Well, I think Gates of Heaven and Vernon, Florida are two of the funniest movies ever made. So,
but I think, well, with both Morris's and Herzog's movies, I think you get kind of what you put into them, if that makes any sense. Like, people can sit there and watch these movies. People could watch The Thin Blue Line and never once laugh, never once think it's funny. It wouldn't cross their mind because of how it's shot. I mean, it doesn't lead you necessarily in that direction, but you can also interpret it as funny in a lot of ways. And I just feel like it's both this movie and Stroszek, which we'll talk about, just kind of like let things happen, and it's kind of like up to you how you want to read into it.
Well, you can put me in column A there. I didn't find anything, well, I won't say anything. The humor bits for me were what you've already mentioned, like where the one guy just goes off and talking about Dillinger or that, but I don't know, showing the movies and the time of the Carol Burnett show and the milkshake and the clock with the popcorn and stuff. Yeah, it's maybe hokey in some ways, but to me, I didn't think it was intentionally supposed to be humorous. I really thought that those details...
I've never said any of that was supposed to be funny. I just say there's an ingrained quirkiness and humor in his films that I think is 100% intentional. And 98.
And it's dry though. It's a dry
humor.
It's funny because you mentioned Unsolved Mysteries, which the TV show that was pretty popular in the 90s. I mean, that show was funny because the show was even more bombastic and more like Art Bell late night radio kind of crap, whereas Morris never ever strays into that territory. He's very serious, and the humor comes from how serious he is, but he never crosses into the line of parody that a lot of these TV shows that are Morris never panders to his audience, and I find the TV shows they play on that. Morris wants you to see every one of the 50,000 words that he writes and understand every one of the 50,000 words. And some people might find that level of, pedantic to be a bad thing, but it's so much his strength that it would be crazy to say a lot of people don't like this, I'm going to stop doing it. That's what he does, and he's exceptionally good at doing it.
Well, one interesting aspect of the film, talking about the idea of using reenactments and whatnot in documentary and whether or not that goes against everything that documentaries are supposed to be. This one has like two strikes on it because normally, Sean, you mentioned this as being like a journalistic sort of thing. Morris affects what's happening in this story. Normally people would try to avoid having any sort of effect on their subjects or become a part of the story, and he almost seeked that out. His whole goal was, I'm going to try and reveal that this guy is innocent because I think he is. And not only did he attempt to do that, but he has an actual section in the film of his voice talking to Harris about whether or not he did it. And I mean, that's something that could be frowned upon by a lot of people. Did you guys think that that was a issue at all?
Well, I mean, for me, it's like if he hadn't done that, I don't know if there would have been much of a movie here. You know what I mean? Like there are kind of these courtroom Paradise Lost and those kinds of movies where the case itself is interesting and right off the bat there's doubt cast on if it's true or not, and you kind of look at both sides. But in this case, it was almost like before he came along, it seemed like nobody was questioning it. So if he hadn't come in and started to, make it a goal of his to figure out that this guy was, to prove that this guy was innocent, then I don't know if it would have been a very interesting movie. But so, I mean, I'm all for it in this case, but I can see how some people might, if you are trying to document something, that you should be kind of the passive observer and not influence what happens. But I mean, I believe that's kind of impossible, but, I guess some people think you should strive for that as much as possible.
Well, it's interesting, that last tape that they play, just listening to, being able to hear his line of questioning and knowing that this is the moment where he gets what he wants. And his line of questioning is very interesting because he kind of works him up to this confession. Like, it starts as not even a confession. It starts as like, asking, do you think that, why do you think Adams was, ended up going to prison? He says he's just had some bad luck. Why do you think why was he unlucky? Well, and then it, like, that question, eventually it goes from Harris talking about, supposing why he went to prison and everything, eventually to, I know why he went to prison. And then, why do you know why he went to prison? Because I did it. Why did you do it? I did it because of this. And it's interesting seeing that line of questioning flowing and realizing his ability to talk to people.
Yeah, I mean, it must come from his experience as an investigator, because I don't think the average documentary filmmaker would necessarily think like that. Like, they would go for the jugular right away.
No, and just his guts. I mean, he's kind of famous for leaving people hanging. And Werner Herzog does this as well, where you just, you ask them a question, they answer it, and then you just don't fill in any gaps. And eventually the person will uncomfortably fill in the gaps and start talking, and something will come out. So the ability to sit there, and that's tough, to sit there and just look at someone and wait for them to fill in the gaps. It's an interesting technique.
Well, it's totally dynamite in the movie because they didn't film Harris while they did this. You just see the tape recorder, and so it almost forces you as the viewer to listen. You've got no body language, you've got no visual reactions to judge. You're purely forced to focus on just the audio. And I mean, I read that the reason why they did that is because the motor in the camera died and they were forced to do that. But I mean, well, also, it seems like the best possible way to do that. So it was like a lucky accident.
Yeah. It's the most, talking about genre filmmaking and, mysteries. And it reminds me of just, seeing a reel to reel and the
Evil Dead one.
Yeah, it's perfect. And he does mention that when he asked him if he committed the crime, he just slyly smiled and nodded, which is something you don't see, but
you hear.
Yeah, you hear it in Morris's questioning. So it's a pretty crazy moment in the film, I think.
Yeah. All right. Well, Omar, Andrew, any other thoughts from your end of the virtual table?
Not really. Did anyone notice that Adams looked like John Hawkes, the actor?
No.
He reminded me of someone. I don't know.
Me too. The guy from Murphy Brown.
A combination of him and Ryan Stiles. Was that his name? From Whose Line Is It Anyway?
It's like John Hawkes and Billy Bob Thornton.
Yeah. Well, he's so laid back. I guess because he's been in prison unfairly for so long. It's just sort of, where you go through all the stages of rage, denial, blah, blah, blah. He's completely in the, I'm so comfortable about it, he can just lean back in his chair and chat with Morris so casually. He's not in any way self-incriminating or whatever. It actually goes completely against the whole thing in The Usual Suspects, where the if you want to spot the killer in the prison, it's the guy getting a good night's sleep. And in this case, it's completely the opposite. I mean, he's just resigned to the fact that he drew the short straw in the karmic draw, and it's great to watch. He's a very cinematic, like more than Harris. He's a very cinematic character, and I think a lot of the other subjects in the film aren't. I mean, that goes without saying. If you just grab a bunch of people, very few of them are going to be good for the camera. But it's interesting that the, I guess, hero or victim, I don't know what Adams is in the movie, but he's the most cinematic presence, and he's the most interesting. He's more interesting than the detectives. He's more interesting than any of the witnesses. And until you get to the tape with Harris, he's the most interesting guy to watch. If it was all talking heads just with him, I would have enjoyed the movie as well. I just liked hearing him talk, and I can't believe that anyone would buy this guy as a criminal. I mean, the total Psych 101.
Because I'm watching the movie and I'm thinking the same thing. Like, this guy is, doesn't seem like the kind of guy. And then they start showing some of those pictures of what he looked like at the time. And I don't know, little shady.
He looks like Werner Herzog.
It's that bushy hair, man.
Bushy hair.
Everyone looked shady back then.
Sorta.
Well, Harris doesn't strike me as a multiple murderer as well, or a violent guy, because he's so laid back as well, and he's kind of aloof about it. And you see even older photos of him when he was being arrested in Texas. He had this, beach blonde hair and looked like a surfer, basically. It looked like Matthew McConaughey in fucking, what's it called?
Fool's Gold?
Surfer dude?
Into the Blue. No.
Sahara?
No, the old one. Fucking
Dazed and Confused.
Dazed and Confused, exactly. So he didn't strike me as a killer as well, but at the same time, there was something off about him.
Yeah,
because
like
he had this
autistic or something.
I mean, he had this sort of chip on his shoulder, like just like a no remorse cockiness to him that I think really comes through, where Adams is just sincere and just even their posture, like Harris is just kind of sitting back and always has half a grin on his face and just seems like someone who's hiding something.
Yeah.
Well, and the title of the movie, the Thin Blue Line, I found that interesting. I mean, this thing needed a resolution very fast because it was a cop that was murdered, and they take that very seriously. And the movie is in reference to, I guess, a saying of what the police are, this thin blue line. But I found, if anything else, the movie was not about like the cop himself, or there was the procedure element, the detective element, but it never felt like it was about the beat cops, which I think the Thin Blue Line is the most in reference to. So it's a catchy title. It's an interesting title, but it's very misleading, I thought.
Well, I think most people probably don't know what it means. I mean, you find out in the film what it means. I think people going in wouldn't.
Yeah. But if this film was made today, don't you think they would have had a segment about the cop that was killed? Because he was hardly mentioned at all, only in the beginning, and you never knew anything about him.
He's basically just another piece of evidence.
Well, that's another Errol Morris thing, where he's kind of like glosses over the human details and just gets into the important stuff.
But. Well, but he doesn't. He doesn't gloss over the human details. He glosses over the most obvious dramatic details and focuses on the woman who watches TV a lot and wants to be a investigator and thinks she is one, and the guy who was driving with the woman stashed in his car doesn't want his wife to know. In the drive-in theater, he focuses in on those quirks of humans, and I think that's more interesting than learning, he was a family man.
That would be the
He was a
unsolved
rookie.
mysteries. That would
was-
be the unsolved mysteries approach, which is funny that everyone that ripped him off by taking the 180-degree approach, like looking at the facts that he didn't. Although I must admit, he really does go to town on that lady officer in the movie. Maybe this is a post-gender world that it just seems like they just go to town on that lady, and she doesn't really ever get a chance to represent herself. They basically just make her look like completely and utterly incompetent.
Yeah.
Which may have been the case, but it came off as particularly harsh considering it was her partner that was killed.
True.
And the fact she was such a bad shot, she couldn't even get a proper bullet hole in the back of the car. Women.
Yeah.
And she didn't know the difference between those two models of cars, which any guy obviously would have known.
Yeah. But I mean, one thing probably worth mentioning before we end it is the music. I mean, just like using a cinematographer that comes from the film world, using Philip Glass to score this is a pretty big and interesting choice for a documentary. And I think the music is right alongside the visuals as a characteristic of the film that stands out and makes it the film that it is.
Yeah, I think the music is kind of essential because of the fact that it is a little bit of a slower paced film and because it's taking its time with stuff, I feel like the music needs to be there to set the tone and the atmosphere. And I didn't even realize that he did the music for this until I put it in, and I was like, nice. I'm ready for this. All right, well, any other final thoughts on The Thin Blue Line?
Nope.
Okay, so
did anyone see the Rowan Atkinson series of the same name?
It is funny how many shows and documentaries have been, or other things have been named that. But when Jay first mentioned it, that was the first thing I thought of, was the Rowan Atkinson series, because for whatever reason, the video store, when I was going to the University of Waterloo, like the alternative video store, had a huge British TV section, VHS copies, and for whatever reason, that one was always out in front. So it was funny that it was exactly the first thing I thought of when it was first brought up last time.
Maybe next episode.
I've never seen it though. I've never seen the show.
Well, apparently,
Very good.
William Friedkin also did a documentary in 1966 about police and the problems they encounter, called The Thin Blue Line.
And then there was the Malick movie, which was the proper use of that expression, which it was a war expression, right? The British soldiers, the Thin Red Line, which came out way after this movie, but then it also adds to the confusion because you've got these two incredibly well-received movies on completely different subjects with almost the same title, just different color.
Yeah, see, I wish I would have thought of it earlier, because I totally would have suggested that we put them together, even though it would have made no sense whatsoever.
way more sense to mix things with Stroszek, because the connection here is the fact that the two filmmakers do fictional films and documentaries, and they were personal friends, and they both are idiosyncratic people, and they're both completely like the opposite. Like I imagine just being in a room with Morris and Herzog arguing would be pretty awesome. Just to because they Morris makes huge money doing commercials and promos and all these sorts of things. Like he did all the Apple, like Think Different or Switch, or the white background campaigns. Yep. And he did some things for the Oscars and that. And Werner Herzog thinks, has been on record many times saying that commercials as the common language is the death of human society. Like, it's just funny that they're so opposite in their approach.
Yeah, no, that's true. I guess we should get into Stroszek then, which 1977, according to this, is that right? I thought I read 76 somewhere before, but Jay, why don't you give us an intro for this one?
Well, you were asking before, or saying you weren't sure what the connection was between these two movies, and I guess the only direct connection is when Errol Morris was researching his Ed Gein documentary. He was going to shoot it in Wisconsin because that's where he was from. And when Herzog came down to do the grave robbing, he took a liking to the Wisconsin landscapes and basically stole it from Morris for Stroszek, and I guess that is one sticking point between the relationship. And then later on, when Herzog ate his shoe at one of the premieres, it apparently really pissed off Errol Morris. But so this movie is the story of Bruno S., who I guess his last name in this is supposed to be Stroszek, and in reality, what is it, like Steinem or something? Schleinstein. And he practically plays himself to a degree. A guy who's just gotten out of prison, has some issues as, I guess, sort of an alcoholic, and he ends up getting together with Eva, who's a lady of the night, and his neighbor, this older gentleman. And when Eva starts falling into some trouble with her pimp, played by Vigo from Ghostbusters 2, they decide to go to America, and they relocate to Wisconsin, and they find that it's just as rough in America, but for different reasons.
Right. Well, I guess I'll start with my impressions. This was my first time seeing the movie. And I gotta say, like, the first half, I thought it was a little dull, and I was kind of wondering where it was going. And, you know, there was some interest with the pimps. You know, they were kind of, when they came in and started raising hell, it was kind of interesting, but definitely a bit slow to start. And when they moved to Wisconsin, things change up a bit. Still a little bit slow, and I'm still kind of wondering where this is all going. And there's a point in this movie where I suddenly realized, like, I just almost did a 180, like, where I went from not really caring, not really having any interest, to being like, I am totally on board. And I think it was the bank robbery scene, which, I mean, at that point, the movie almost turned into Falling Down for me, if that makes any sense. And then, of course, the ending, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, is completely nuts, but awesome. So, yeah, I ended up enjoying Stroszek a fair amount, and it was quite an interesting watch.
Well, it was a first-time watch for me as well, and I've seen a lot of Herzog films, but he's so prolific that there's still a lot of holes in my filmography, and I haven't seen the other one with Bruno S. in it, the
Enigma of Caspar Hauser.
And I must say, of all the films that we've done for the Movie Club podcast, I'd say about half of them I haven't seen, like, had their first time watches going in. That Stroszek was the best one ever. Like, that movie, I don't think I've had as much fun watching a movie, like, and I don't just mean when the movie goes like completely crazy at the end. I mean when the mechanic is just, for no reason that I can tell, pulling out a tooth, or when the banker, the obsequious banker, keeps coming in. Like, that guy was awesome, and the pimps were great. Completely unaware of the Ghostbusters 2 connection, but that just makes it more awesome. And then him playing his accordion in the middle of a courtyard, or him going on a personal discussion to the doctor. I mean, I don't know. The movie is it's the opposite of Morris. It's so loose, and it feels more like a documentary than The Thin Blue Line does. It feels like you're just following this guy around. He talks to him about his pianos, and he philosophizes they teach the bird how to talk. I mean, the movie is really not in a hurry to get anywhere, but at the same point, it was just so much fun to watch these guys. And then when it becomes a movie, when it actually has a point, and that actually kind of started to annoy me. It's like, oh, Herzog's, angry young man, and he just wants to fucking give his thoughts on America, and it started to get yawning, but then it turns into this sublimely black comedy of just epic proportions. And then by the time you get to the very end, it was 100 times of awesome. I love this movie.
All right, Omar.
Well, this is the first time for me as well. I found this film to be it didn't blow me away. I wasn't as excited about it as Kurt was, but I enjoyed it. I was never bored or anything like that, but I was kind of searching for a point, but then I kind of figured that this film was basically, after I read more about it, I basically found out this film was made as a favor for Bruno S. because Herzog screwed him over a job for Wojciech. And so it feels like it was most likely just improvised, almost all of it. And apparently he wrote the script in 3 days. So it kind of looks like that way, and but it helps to have these interesting world characters and these actors, especially Mr. Scheitz was awesome, and the pimps as well, especially Vigo. He was also in Mouth of Madness, I see. So.
Yeah, he awesome. Blows his head off in the Mouth of Madness.
Yeah, exactly. And he was also in Die Hard, one of the German boys. So... but I also agree with Kurt in that when it looks like the film is trying to actually say something about how horrible America is, and it isn't the land of opportunity that everybody thinks it is. It started to get, it didn't impress me that much. But then that fucking bank robbery, barber robbery was.
Barbary.
It was quite awesome. Just seeing this old dude with that shotgun was fucking awesome. But other than that, I mean, it's I think. What Jay usually said, it is what it is. I mean, it's. I don't think there's a lot of substance in it. I don't know if you guys think that, but it feels to me just something he did for fun, and he just he went to America, had just to shoot some stuff in the environment he clearly enjoyed.
I think it was almost like when Jon Favreau and Vince Vaughn did Couples Retreat just to go to Hawaii. I think Herzog did this just to go to Wisconsin.
To Plainsview.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so, I mean, I enjoyed it. It's not a masterpiece, but, it's fine. I found Bruno S. to be kind of annoying at times. He's not a really good actor, but he's not an actor to begin with, but he was interesting at least, and that what basically saves the movie is these interesting, weird, dirty, filthy characters that inhabit it. Especially the mechanic when he was, I don't know what the fuck the scene was about.
The fake sex,
fake sex, and this long shot of him trying to get his attention of. Swaying his hips. It was, yeah.
All right.
So yeah, that's basically what I think.
All right, Andrew.
Yeah, my turn. Yep, first time view for me as well, and I love this movie. For me, it was all about the tone. I mean, actually, I was on board right away when Bruno shows up, and just just strange and odd way of behaving. I mean, I thought that the guy was, slightly retarded, in a way, and maybe he is. And I sort of felt like he was actually that way in real life. But then from there on out, it sort of felt like an experimental Soderbergh movie, like where he just, like, I think Kurt said a documentary feel to it, and I did get a little bit of that. Like, it just feels so believable. All the characters doesn't feel like they're acting. It feels like that guy really is a mechanic, and
he was.
I think most of them are non-actors.
The banker was a banker. The mechanic was a mechanic.
Yeah, it felt like a sort of like Bubble or the Girlfriend Experience or whatever. It kind of, but the tone of the movie I really, really liked. I just dug. For whatever reason, like there's a shot of them in the car after they bought that new car and they're driving, and it's a guitar playing in the background, and you just see them sitting in the car, and it feels like, for 3 minutes we're just watching them as they drive in silence. And there's a number of those scenes. They'd show it again in the tow truck, and for one reason or another, the feeling and the vibe I get from those types of shots, or just her washing dishes and him sitting in the kitchen practicing his accordion, I dug the hell out of it. I really had a good time. I mean, I was at a 4 out of 5 level on this movie all the way through until the final 15 minutes, and it became pretty much a 5 out of 5 film for me as well. The robbery was funny, and then as soon as they go across the street to spend the money immediately on turkeys and bread, then I was just like, this is hilarious. And then it goes off from there. But yeah, I was big into this movie. I got sort of a Steven Soderbergh 2-lane blacktop meets Silent Light kind of thing going
meets
on.
Coming to America.
Well, no, there's someone should put together a film festival of losers unequipped to survive on the road movies. Like there's that famous Canadian movie, the Going Down the Road, with the two Newfies that come up to Toronto, and it has almost the exact same story as this movie. They come up, they buy a couple garishly expensive things just because the credit is available, and then they just get ground down and forced into a life of crime because they can't pay their bills. And I mean, Herzog goes right out of his way to beat you over the head with the message. I think at one point Bruno says, in Germany, I was just beaten. And when I came to America, I was beaten by the fine print in the contracts. But at the same point, Bruno's still being beaten. And he just seems like a person that's unequipped to make decisions outside of the moment, and which is why when you watch the movie, all those individual moments are so excellent. But then when you see that, he has to survive, he has to continue, he seems very ill-equipped to do so. And I mean, it is a valid comment on the United States and capitalism, but it's also an interesting comment on the fact that Bruno really is, ill-equipped to survive just by who he is, just because he's so interesting and sort of self-absorbed in the moment. He just is not, and his hooker girlfriend, she wasn't either.
Well, I think that it's interesting that I don't think we ever actually find out why he was in prison, do we?
No.
I mean, that's an alcoholic, right? And I like that idea. He just gets out, and we know that somehow he's disturbed in some way. He did something, and I kept waiting for that to present itself. Like, I thought for sure that the two guys that kept bullying him and the girl, it turns out that they were just sort of a catalyst to get them to come to America. They had nothing to do with what the movie is saying and the actual story. It's just sort of a starting point for them to get on the road. And so those two things, the fact that we don't know why he was in prison, what kind of person he is, like, I kept waiting for him to snap or for those two guys to show up in America again. I don't know. It's like a plot that could have gone anywhere, and it sort of stayed restrained and on task for what the purpose of the film was, and I like that.
He sort of course, snaps in the end. and with massive amounts of alcohol. And it's clearly said in the beginning that all his problems are because he's an alcoholic. And and when he finally snaps, he loads the truck up with beer and the turkey, and goes off on this weird, unexplained. It's not even a rampage. He just drives off angrily and buys a sandwich.
This is maybe going to sound weird, but the Bruno guy kind of reminded me of Carl Pilkington. Did anybody else get that at all?
He looks like him a little bit.
Yeah, like he looks like him, and just that he was kind of mild-mannered a little bit, and I don't know. I just couldn't get it out of my head.
Again, kind of beyond mentally unstable, like mentally challenged.
Well, he is mentally. He does have mental problems. I mean, the if you look at the history of the actor in quotations, he has a pretty insane life. He had a pretty insane life at that point.
Interesting. I don't know
so he had spent, I think, 17 years or something in a mental institution, and his mom was a prostitute, and he was a mistake. She used to beat him, blah, blah, blah. So a lot of the stuff in the film was drawn from his real life. And, but I think that, talking about humor and whatnot, and Werner Herzog always says he has an inability to experience irony or understand irony, and never really knows why people are laughing at things. But I mean, come on, the guy has a sense of humor.
Yep.
I mean, the first thing that happens when Bruno gets out of jail, they say, whatever you do, don't drink, and then he literally walks around the corner and goes in and orders a beer
at a place called Beer Heaven.
So I mean,
and before he says, I promise I won't go do it, the way he says it is like, his eyes are crossed and he's kind of looking at the floor, and he puts his hand up in a pledge and says, "On my Hungarian pride of honor, sir." Like, he's almost drunk as he's saying it, or he appears to be. So that it was all humorous to me. I thought almost every line in the movie that he had was funny as hell.
And just talking about like imagery and direction and cinematography, and I mean, I remember having many discussions with Reed Farrington about what good cinematography is, or what a cool image is, and in his mind it is always just two Asians on wires with like lotus leaves falling and swords.
He's looking for that sort of floaty gracefulness.
Yeah, the Jing Mu, that's his name, right?
Yeah.
Stuff. And yeah, that's one aspect of it. But with Herzog, I mean, he's known for his imagery. And it's not necessarily what the camera is doing. It's not necessarily that, the cinematography is flashy or whatever, the composition. It's what he captures. And it seems to me that he kind of loads up on all of these experiences that he's had, or these things that have happened to him, or what he's seen, and, writes them down or something, or has them stored away somehow that, oh, in this movie, this is about this, so I'm going to bring this in. I'm going to bring in the chicken that's hypnotized by the straight line, or the, whatever, and uses those. And in this, it's like, the image of Bruno playing the accordion and the thing in the courtyard, and the whole scene with the doctor talking about the baby, gripping the fingers.
Is awesome.
Like, that's just the stuff that Herzog does. The talking bird, anything with weird sort of like, it's almost like a weird life lesson when you watch a Werner Herzog movie. You're seeing things that you have never seen. Like, even in Red Dawn,
Wolverines.
In Rescue Dawn, when Christian Bale wakes up and the kid's holding that beetle that's attached to the string. And I mean, this guy has images coming out of his asshole. and the final scene with the dancing chicken, and it's just, that is those are amazing images. And what the camera is doing isn't important. It's what's happening. His truck going in circles as it's on fire.
Well, there's
there's a lot of powerful stuff in this movie. And yeah, I guess the pacing is deliberate, But even when the pimps are terrorizing Bruno and he gets him to go up on the piano and he puts the bell on his head and the bell on his ass, and like, who does a scene like that? Like, I know that was improvised, but I mean, one big part of Herzog's direction is his willingness to have people just lose their shit.
Yeah, absurdity. And he likes that intense absurdity.
Yeah, and it's like people are constantly teetering on the edge of being too overboard, and he allows them to do it the whole time, and he won't let them fall over and make a fool of themselves, but he'll keep them on that line. And obviously Bad Lieutenant is the most recent example of that, and it works in this. I mean, you've got the scene where the old man is doing testing for animal magnetism, and he's with those two hunters, and it clearly is like there were some hunters, they saw them, let's go ask these guys to be in this movie. He's not even speaking English, they have no idea what's going on, and it just plays as this weird real scene. And this is probably my favorite of his dramatic films. But I mean, that's where his documentaries and his dramatic filmmaking cross. He uses these images to get a emotional reaction out of people. That's the thing. He always talks about his distaste for academia, and no wonder his films are so built on a visceral response based on the images that he puts in them. And they're all about life.
But it's completely, I mean, this movie clearly has a very clear, easy to process message. I mean, I love that scene with the baby for how brutal the doctor is. Like he's treating the baby like at a butcher shop, which of course is what Bruno is going to go through. So this is like the beginning of his life to, I mean, eventually you see the motorhome. That's another great image where he's just standing there and the motorhome pulls out of the frame. But that image completely ties in with the three images at the end of the movie where you have the truck on fire in circles, the endless ski lift going around, and all the three animals doing their like burlesque show. And then that's Herzog's incredibly black sense of humor of people spend their whole lives doing these repetitive tasks and not really worried about it. They're just trapped on the treadmill, and he I mean, that's not Herzog at all. I mean, he goes out of his way to make things as random and unpredictable as possible, but I think he sees an absurdity in that, and out of all of his films, I think he captures it better in this one than any of them. But having recently seen Bad Lieutenant, I found it interesting that they had a direct callback in this with that harmonica player. He uses the same musical track in one of the wackier scenes in Bad Lieutenant, and it's the closing music. I mean, it's in a way he's ripping himself off.
These two movies, like Bad Lieutenant and Stroszek, I think would make like a great two kind of double header. And like, it's weird because I mean, I haven't seen a lot of Werner Herzog's fictional stuff. Like, I've only seen, I think, a couple of his more recent ones, and I haven't seen a lot of his earlier ones, but it just kind of, I mean, this definitely makes me want to delve a little deeper into other stuff he's done. But I mean, I guess that would be a question for you, Jay. Like, how does this, you said this is your favorite of his fictional films, but like, how does this movie fit into his filmography? Because like, to me, I was thinking, well, I haven't really heard of it too much, but like, it's not necessarily the most prominent, important must-see Werner Herzog movie, but it's pretty enjoyable. I mean,
well, it's one of them. I mean, it's not, I guess, his most, I know Enigma of Caspar Hauser, I think, won one of the Cannes prizes, like the Palme d'Or or something, and Fitzcarraldo is probably his big hit critically and not necessarily financially, but I mean, I enjoyed this more than Caspar Hauser, and this is a interesting one because it's one of the few films of his that's set in modern day. So I liked it. I liked seeing his portrayal of modern America, or even modern Germany. And the whole message of, the being beat in Germany and the fine print in America. I mean, I guess it's there and it's whatever, but I just thought it was more interesting that, not necessarily that America is bad, but both things are bad, and Bruno just can take a beating easier, is an interesting thing to say about his character, that, he tells a story about holding his sheet up and Nazis whipping him, and as though that's even on the same plane as a banker coming in and getting, trying to get him to sign a piece of paper to resolve him of his loan debt. But I mean, I think it's just a matter of Herzog having so many ideas and just using some films to get certain things out there. And this one was clearly a vehicle to get a lot of the stuff that Bruno had in his life and on his mind out there. And the combination of those two brains is an interesting product in the end.
I think like Herzog is in some ways he's like a walking contradiction almost, because he, on the one hand, he's got like this cold, detached, logical way of looking at things, and it's almost like doesn't really feel the emotions of things. He just kind of like lays them out there bluntly for people to see. But on the other hand, he's like, the way he shoots movies and stuff, it's like he almost seems to act instinctively and just kind of use what's around him, and it's very improvised, and it's not logical at all. It's like the complete opposite. So he's got like these two sides to him in all his movies, and it's just this weird push and pull I find with almost all of them, even whether it's fictional or nonfiction.
Yeah, he's a human being. It's just funny. I mean, with reason, it's his own fault with all the stories he tells about himself, but he's become this mythological character that everyone thinks doesn't have the ability to sense irony and doesn't have a sense of humor and looks at things in one way and no other way. I mean, he's self-aware. He's a human being. He's playing people he was in Incident at Loch Ness and clearly poking fun at his own mythology. If you can't tell me he wasn't aware.
Someone once said that every film would be better if it was narrated by Werner Herzog for precisely that reason.
And I mean, he's aware of this, and it doesn't mean he's not genuine, but I mean, when he tells a story about being held captive by like 13-year-olds with guns in South Africa, or wherever it was, and having to speak French to get out of it, and then saying he regrets having spoken French. I mean, that's a joke.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you get the sense that he definitely is playing with people in one way or another, and even like the quote about him saying that academia is bullshit. Like, I don't know if he 100% believes that, because I mean, he maybe in a certain sense, yes, but I mean, he certainly has a lot of his own philosophies on life, and he's not like a 100% left brain or right brain. I don't know but I just I think he can go both ways, and he just he'll flip it to suit his needs. But yeah, I mean, getting back to what you're saying about imagery, there's a lot of interesting stuff in this movie. Like early on, there's that shot where it opens up and he zoomed in on like was it like a bag of water or something that was hanging?
Bottle of water,
and then he kind of like slowly pulls out from that. And I mean, it's like just something where I don't know if he specifically hung that up there for that reason, but just working with what's around him and being like, this is going to be interesting, and he just does it. And not many other people kind of react in that way in terms of coming up with visuals for movies, and I guess that's why his movies look so unique.
He's the Zack Snyder of the 1970s.
Yes.
Does how did everyone
fucking spit it out, man? Jesus.
Fuck off.
Way to go, Jay.
What did we think of the ending?
Yeah. How did you? How would you describe it? It was the guy when the explosion happens. Is it Bruno S blowing his brains out or the car exploding? Because you never see him again.
I think it's supposed to be. He
goes out of frame and then the explosion happens, or the gun sound, or whatever.
I think it's him blowing his brains out.
That's the impression I got as well.
Yeah.
But I love when they show the cops they arrive, and there's the one cop. He's clearly a real cop, and they just got him to say what he needed to say. And it's something like, "We got a car that's on fire. We've got the ski lift going in circles, and the chicken won't stop dancing. Over."
Send an electrician. That's the sublime absurdity of Herzog, and I mean he channels that in Bad Lieutenant totally. Those two films did remind me of each other.
Well, you know what's something that I was thinking about too is like the whole fact that a lot of the people in the movie are not actors, but because it's not an English language film, it's kind of like I wonder how this would play if we actually knew. 'Cause, like you feel like a little bit removed from it. Like I couldn't, you can obviously tell some of these people aren't really good actors. They're just kind of being themselves, and you get that feeling. But like I wonder if it would add to it or if it would take away from it if it was in English.
Well, if you're looking for direct proof, I could point to a couple people in the film that clearly aren't very good at acting.
Okay.
I mean, the guy in the diner picking up Eva, the trucker.
I totally bought that. I
buy it to a degree, but if you look at it, we've had this discussion before about Soderbergh's films, and I mean, what's worse, a real person who's a real trucker just saying the lines is what they would say, or getting some hack fucking actor that is trying to build his IMDb credits, come in and say overact like, "You want to meet me behind the restaurant later?" Like, okay, one is a real person who can't act, but at least it's got a weird sincerity to it. And the other person is just an actor who can't fucking act, and he totally takes you out of it. Like, they're both taking you out of it. At least have a real person take you out of it.
Plus that particular truck driver was a dead ringer for Mike Schenk from American Movie. Even the way he picked her up, it's just I thought he was good. And when they're in the truck later,
he was good on the CB.
Yeah,
clearly he knows how to work a CB.
But I think when it comes to situations like that, I think it's more like if you're going to have one non-actor, surround him with more non-actors, and then it feels more like it's not he doesn't stand out as much, right? But it's like when one person.
Well, it depends. I mean, look at United 93. That movie is a split of non-actors and actors, and it is the most, in my opinion, the most successful split of non-actors and actors, because I could swear that some of the people on the plane in that movie were the people that were on the plane, but obviously they weren't. I mean, to see the one guy appear in Hellboy blew my mind, because there were people on that plane that were so real. And then the guy, Ben Sliney, who is the traffic controller, is so real, but not even on I'm the real guy and I'm
just doing
being
his
real.
Job. Yep.
He is real with a sense of drama behind it. Like, that he is seriously feeling what he's feeling and saying in that moment. Like, that guy is above and beyond. When they had him doing that, he must have channeled what he went through on that day, because he is brilliant in that movie. And I don't think there are, not everyone in this film is on that level, nor do they have to be, really. But the banker, I mean, yeah, sometimes you can see him trying to act a little bit, but it works because he would be acting, because he's being a banker, trying to smooth them into signing these things. He's a slick guy.
The movie got better every time he walked on screen.
Yeah.
That guy was so good.
But I mean, a good example of someone trying to get a non-actor to say a line that maybe isn't so successful is the auctioneer who does the fast talking. He's actually in. Herzog did a documentary called "How Much Wood Would a Woodchuck Chuck?" and it's about those auctions, and he's in that documentary. And he's perfect as the auctioneer. But then when the old man comes up to him and says, this is all a conspiracy, what are you doing? And then the auctioneer just turns to him and says, I cannot understand your language, and then drives away.
Right.
It's like, whatever. I don't care. It doesn't bother me. Like I said, I'd rather have that than like some 2-bit fucking guy who wants to be an actor overacting. But
I actually thought when he dismissed them, that's how people that are completely unable to process the language do react. I actually found I don't
think they would say cannot. He'd probably say, I can't understand you, and drive away. He wouldn't be, I cannot understand your language.
A lot of people do that when they're talking to people that don't speak English. They slow down again. I actually completely bought that. And when he is in auctioneering mode, that auction scene, like you said earlier, of the way Herzog can capture real moments or take advantage of what's there. That auction scene is awesome. It totally works when he goes into the auctioneering mode. It's mesmerizing. It's just mesmerizing to watch that guy do what he does.
And that auction scene, is built around the fact that Herzog thinks that those auctioneers, it's like another form of poetry or music. Yep. Mm-hmm. So he puts a scene in there where there's an auction because he has these guys. So he'll do a documentary on it as well and whatever. But yeah. But I like the use of non-actors.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of made me wish I could just hang out with the auctioneer guy a little bit, just get him to do it on command. Yeah. It'd be pretty fun.
But I do think that having an actress play Eva was a good choice. Like, there are some roles that, talking about putting non-actors with non-actors, I don't know, sometimes it's good to have someone to ground things a little bit. It just depends on the abilities of that actor.
Well, all the coffee shop sequences feel incredibly authentic. Mm-hmm. Like when she's just in there and she's making small talk with some of the people and keeping everyone's coffee full and that, I mean, it feels very authentic to me. And I think that's what makes this movie work, is that it's not trying to, most of the time, it's not trying to be a movie. It feels more like it's a document, and he's blurred the line so many which ways that you just sit back and say, well, what does Herzog find interesting today, and what he's going to show me next? And the fact that or myself personally, I'm willing to absolutely go along with that. And he does change tone many times in the movie, and I found none of those tonal changes to be particularly jarring, and I'm like, wow, that everything works, and he makes it from the get-go that it's going to be fast and loose. Like, that right from the bar scene when he goes in, and even how that's framed, and then him playing the accordion, and then them leaving Germany, and then them getting the tour guide of Plainsview, which is not even I mean, it's not called Plainsview in the movie, but essentially that mechanic is giving him the tour of Plainsview.
Oh, that reminds me, sorry to interrupt before I forget, another humorous thing, and which kind of ties into Thin Blue Line a little bit, like talking about details and everything. On that tour, when the guy's talking about how everything's flat, that's why they call it
railroad crossing.
Yeah, and talking about the murderer, there were 4 murderers, now I think there's 5, and I use a metal detector to go to the pond, and blah, blah, blah. All mundane conversation. But the humor is the fact that we hear him tell it, and then we hear someone else retranslate it to Bruno as though this is so important that we hear it twice, which I think is funny. I always find it interesting in films when they deal with translation and how they deal with it, especially in documentaries, but I think it's for humor.
You get a scene later on. Like, again, it has nothing to do with the through line of this movie, but you do get a long shot scene where the pond is in the frame, and you see that you can't really even make out the actors, they're so far away, but you see them with the metal detector and walking around the pond, and generally the movie feels lived in, as well as making his, fairly overt political points. But more than anything else, all the characters and all the scenes and all the locations and everything is lived in. I mean, he even calls attention to it with the stains on the piano and the cleaning of the stains. It's just to say that these are found objects. These are objects that that the actor owns, and the mechanic shop the mechanic owns, and I'm sure the truck driver owned the flatbed truck that they drive to Vancouver that his girlfriend leaves them for.
I think the mechanic owned that Indian guy too in real life.
But you mentioned earlier that with the Thin Red Line where it actually broke the case. See, I do that all the time. It actually broke the case. In this movie, it had an impact on life, I guess, in one way, in that the lead singer from Joy Division committed suicide after this was the last thing. I mean, he had plenty of other reasons, but this happened to be the last film that Ian Curtis watched before he committed suicide, and the fact that they pressed a version of one of the albums, and it says, the chicken is still dancing, or the chicken stops, are how they divided up the album, which is a direct reference to the closing futility of the thing. So this, in a way, artificial movie that is kind of documenting part of Bruno's life, the way it played in the culture and the way it actually caused another guy, pushed him over the edge, or if you want to read it that way, is kind of interesting that this movie or a Herzog movie would contribute to something like that. And I'd love to hear what Herzog says, or what his thoughts were at the time when someone told him that Ian Curtis watched this right before he committed suicide. And both of the Ian Curtis documentaries, the 24-Hour Party People, which is kind of a fakey, loosey comedy documentary, and then the Control. I have not seen Control, but apparently they both
neither
feature Stroszek
they do.
in the film.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess in a way we've kind of found the connection right there.
You will never not. There will never not be a connection that can be found. I'm telling you right now.
Well, I guess that's a good
Think
point.
about it hard enough, like anything, and you'll find a connection.
I guess it's interesting that we talked about a documentary that presents things in sort of a fictional way and makes it more of a drama, and then we looked at a drama that presented things in more of a documentary style and non-actors, and it's just kind of flipped the opposite. But yeah,
it blew my mind.
I'm flipping out.
Another successful movie club podcast, I'd say. So, any other final thoughts on Stroszek?
Go and go to Google Video, or you can post the link in the show notes. The Werner Herzog eats his shoe in response to Errol Morris making his first film and pissing Errol Morris off that he took a bit of thunder away from Gates of Heaven by organizing this stunt. Well, they shot the eating of the shoe, and it is online. So I don't know where that falls into, but a lot of the stuff in between, in that Werner Herzog eats his shoe, he's talking about these things with images and films and documentaries and life and all this kind of stuff. And it's just it's a neat tie between these two films. And you, much like this, I don't know, another YouTube clip with Christopher Walken cooking pears and chicken. It's just fun to watch Christopher Walken in his kitchen cooking. It is fun to watch a very stagey Werner Herzog stuffing shoes with onions and garlic and boiling them in anticipation of eating his shoes. A detail that Errol Morris doesn't even remember. And yeah, like Jay said, it kind of pissed him off. So that's a nice little bonus feature in between these two filmmakers.
Right. Okay. Anything else on the other side of the Skype connection?
I got nothing. I just sat here and listened and sort of agreed with everything. I really, really like this movie. I thank Jay for suggesting it or whatever, because it was great. I kind of want to try to buy it. I watched it, streaming online. I want to try to find a copy of this and watch it again and show it to people for sure.
The copy I looked fucking horrible, so I probably didn't get as much enjoyment out of it as I probably would have had been a better copy. But
is it actually available streaming through Netflix? Is that where you watched it?
Yeah, that's where I watched it. So it was a pretty good. I mean, it's not super DVD high def quality, but it's pretty damn good, and you could maybe argue that it's probably better that way for this kind of film. Like I said, I kind of got a two-lane blacktop sort of tone from, it's on the road a little bit, and it's 70s, so it's just got that nice warm bit of imperfection to it that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, no, that's true.
Yeah, screw Easy Rider, watch Stroszek.
All right, well, I guess we'll wrap it up. So for the next episode, this may cause a little bit of controversy, but we're kind of going out on our own again, despite the fact that we put the poll up and a couple of movies came out on top. We're actually switching it around, and for the next episode, we're going to be doing Tarsim's The Fall. And who directed the Saragossa manuscript?
This is bad research on our part, and Gamble's not here.
It was Gamble's suggestion, though.
Yeah, he had actually seen it, and he talked about it for a little bit on one of our shows. But I don't know who directed it. It might be a little bit tough to track down, from what I understand.
No, it's totally available, and I can't pronounce the director's name.
Wojciech Haas.
Wojciech Haas.
There you have it.
Yeah.
So,
Polish dude.
So just for people who aren't aware of what this movie is, what was the bit of background you gave us, Kurt?
It just seems to be one of these films that a lot of directors, Martin Scorsese, Louis Buñuel, they're just a lot of people that make films seem to treasure this film, and it's apparently very surreal. And I mean, Gamble, who's probably listening to this, is tearing his hair out because he loves to talk about this film, and I actually want to have everyone else participate in the conversation on something like this. I've been looking for an excuse personally, and Andrew, I think you're in the same boat, because we have been regaled with tales of this film from Matt on several different Row 3 podcasts, and I've been just looking for an excuse to watch it. So.
And as I'm looking at the be-all and end-all of movie information, the IMDb, the runtime, there's 3 different runtimes. It looks like there's one that's 124 minutes, but the director's cut is 175 minutes, and then there's another one listed that says it's 182. So I actually have a copy of the film, but I don't know which one it is. My guess is it's the director's cut. And from what Matt says, we want to get the longest version possible, I think. So if you can choose between the director's cut or the regular one, I'd probably opt for the director's cut if you can get your handle on it.
All right. Well, we'll see what everyone comes up with. It might be another. There was another movie we watched. Alien. Was it Alien 3? Well, I guess all the Alien movies have.
And the Warriors had multiple cuts. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But this one is significant. I mean, it's an hour.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's true. We should probably agree on one in this case. So hopefully we can all, whatever's most easily available, we'll try and do that one. Okay, so I guess that's about it for this week's, this month's, whatever episode of the Movie Club podcast. So thanks everyone for listening. Of course, we want to hear your comments. So if you've watched these movies with us and listened to the podcast, head over to movieclubpodcast.com and leave your thoughts in the comments over there. And I suppose we will have another poll up on the site this month for the next episode, which we may disregard. I don't know. It's still nice to have some options to choose from and to see what people think out there. So
vote at your own risk.
Yes.
Stop resetting your IP address.
So so that's about it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time here on the Movie Club podcast.
Booyah!
Wow.